Hi there, I'm Jim.
And I'm Julianne.
Let's talk teaching. Welcome to Let's Talk Teaching, a podcast from the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology here at Illinois State University. I'm Jim G. Joining me again, Dr. Julianne McFan. Hi, Julianne.
Hi, Jim.
We are continuing our conversation. We decided to cut that episode a little short because we were talking a lot about concept maps. And if you just have come across this episode, we'll make sure you have a link in the show page to get to the previous episode.
Jim wouldn't let me just go on and on in the previous podcast.
Well, you know, we're talking about organizing student experiences, so we have to organize it's my defense anyway. We want to organize, digestible bits we always talk about. We want to present information in digestible bits.
We'll run with that.
Yeah, we'll run with that. So today we want to continue our conversation, and we want to talk about some of the other strategies. And all of this, of course, is based on How Learning Works, a book that we use a lot here at CTLT. We did a lot on concept maps, but what are some of the other strategies that as a teacher we have at our disposal to help students organize their experiences?
So some of the ways we can help our students encode, organize their information for long-term storage are things we heard about when we were growing up and took a study skills class, here's how you learn. And actually, they're tried and true. One of them is Mnemonic Device. Mm-hmm. And I used this a lot when I was a special ed teacher way back a long time ago. Mm-hmm. But that is where you give your students clues to help them trigger memory, to help them organize it. So like several years ago, we had a keynote speaker with a difficult to pronounce last name, and I created a mnemonic device to help me remember it, which I will not repeat. Because
okay. Yeah, we don't want to give away who that was necessarily.
No, we don't.
Right.
We don't. But yeah. I shared it with everybody, and they went, "Oh yeah, thanks. That helps me remember it." Uh-huh. But I think the one anybody who's studied music at all will remember is "Every good boy does fine" to help them remember the lines on the treble clef. So if you can give them something silly or some clue that is similar to it, to what you're wanting them to learn, then that helps them organize it.
And what I always, because before we started recording today, I said, well, I think I said pneumatic devices at first, which is another.
And I asked him to go check the air in my tires.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah, but mnemonic devices.
Yes.
Always seemed to be very basic to me, like it was very low level learning. But I guess it's really just to trigger everything else.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And in some ways, you have, thinking about the different types of knowledge will help you decide which strategy is most appropriate. So if you have knowledge that is just factual knowledge, recall kinds of things that help provide the foundation for more complex thinking, it may be something like "Every good boy does fine." It's just recall. Students will need that information in order to help them with the more complex things. The example we used in the previous podcast was, as the instructor, you're the superhero leaping across the buildings in and you want your students to be able to do that also. And so sometimes that providing that knowledge base could be like the little afterburners on their feet that will help them. Oh yeah, okay, I can leap across it. So mnemonic device.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I think it also, in a way, it allows you to then have, if you can remember the basics, then as you are creating, as you're analyzing or synthesizing information, as you're creating new knowledge based on experience or what you're observing. Like I had a conversation and I had to explain to someone why the laser beam in your Blu-ray player is more dangerous than the laser beam in your old DVD player. And it has to do with the spectrum, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, etc. And it's because blue light is at a shorter wavelength and can be more damaging or whatever, however that is. But I had to remember the order of the spectrum in order to explain that, no, this light over here is of a different wavelength.
I'm impressed because I didn't remember that spectrum.
There you go.
There you go. Oh, another one that I don't think professors take enough advantage of is storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of literature that shows that if you tell a story about the concept that elaborates on the concept you're teaching, your students may not remember, a particular term, but it helps them understand that big picture of what's going on. And as they're trying to recall or trying to organize their learning, they're like, okay, well, I remember that she said that if you really want to understand dirt, and told a story about going out in the mud and covered mud womping, and I'm showing my age with the mud womping. Do people even mud womp anymore? Or?
I have no idea what you're talking about. So, so apparently not.
Apparently that's a California thing.
It might be. I mean,
it rains. It rains so infrequently that people go and drive in the mud.
Is that what? Is that what?
Yeah.
That is? Yeah. No, I've heard the term, but I never really knew what it was. But no, we got plenty of mud here in Illinois, so that's not a. as you have learned over the last 6 or 7 years, we have plenty of mud around here. So
it's not a.
No, it's not a moment for celebration.
Yes.
Right. So this idea of telling stories to helping us learn really tickles an itch I have, because because in my discipline in communication and whatnot, and the narrative paradigm and the idea that we really understand our world through the stories that we tell each other and tell ourselves.
Yes.
So that resonates with me, I guess, is a way to put it. So,
and you have to think, in classical times, the way to learn was through storytelling. So it is definitely a tried and true method.
Right. So when faculty members are trying to construct stories about a lesson, I guess there's probably a line between effective and overwrought a little bit or something. Do you have any storytelling tips, or are there any storytelling tips that we can get from this?
Have fun. Just that also gets into how humor helps people learn, but make sure it's appropriate humor.
Yeah, humor's tough. Humor's tough on many levels.
Humor is very tough. So have fun, but don't offend.
Right.
And what I've learned is sometimes if you make the story kind of outlandish even, the students will remember it a bit more, because it's not just the run-of-the-mill kind of something they'll encounter all the time.
So what other techniques do we need to keep in mind when we're trying to help students organize experiences?
Another way is association or elaboration. A lot of times we get frustrated because students aren't making those leaps or making those connections, and we're saying, they're not transferring what I taught them last week into what I'm trying to teach them this week. Be overt. Show them, here's how these things connect, and how this builds on that, or how this is similar or dissimilar to what you have already learned.
And that can be a challenge. I mean, sometimes, like some of the things that I cover in the courses I teach are processes, and they're broken up over several lessons, and so it's that there's a natural, okay, last week we talked about breathing, this is how breathing supports the production of sound in your throat, and it's very much there's a logical next step, because we all know what the end result is that we're speaking, but I can imagine in some other ways that's not quite the case.
So what often happens is Chapter 1, week 1, Chapter 1, week 2, Chapter 2, week 3, Chapter 3. And we forget that we need to go back and pull it forward. So the literature says as much as to revisit, I'm making a circular thing here, to revisit what has been taught, and that's how you can bring it forward. Instead of saying, well, we're on Chapter 4, so we don't have to worry about what happened in Chapter 2.
Right.
And they're not going to make, those connections if we are not overt about helping them make those connections. We cannot just assume that they can magically do it. That's magical thinking on our part.
Right. It's funny when you mention chapter order, because there are a lot of times when I will use a textbook in teaching and we'll jump around. And I think in some ways that puts the onus on me, I don't know if I actually succeed in this or not, to help build those connections.
Yes.
Because in some ways I have to explain to them why we're reading Chapter 11 next and not Chapter 3.
Correct.
And that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So, That's interesting. I'll have to look back and make sure I'm not assuming that they're just going to figure out why.
And that's a great point because it makes sense to you why you're doing it.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
they may be not making that leap from
Right.
building to building with you.
Right. Okay. That's a good point. Before we started recording this episode, we had talked a little bit, following up on our discussion of concept maps, and you had mentioned flashcards.
Oh,
And
yes.
I probably gave you that look because, again, like Mnemonic Devices, flashcards to me I've always seen that as being about really basic rudimentary stuff, but it's more than that, isn't it?
Well, so
Or it can be more than that.
it can be.
Yeah.
So your students are going to make flashcards because what they're trying to do is make something that is basically cognitive into something that is behavioral. And so they can write a piece of fact on a card and then flash it in front. I know what this is or I don't know what this is. That's very behavioral. Yes, no. So how we can take that tendency to make it cognitive again is have them create kind of a concept map type of thing using the flashcards. How do you organize how these cards go together?
Okay.
What are the connections that you see? And it requires laying it out on a desk in front of them or a table or so forth. It's a great kind of interactive activity where you have your students work in pairs or 3 or 4 and say, okay, how would you organize these cards? And they can organize their own They can organize their own.
Right, yeah.
And then see how other people organized their set of cards.
Right.
You can see kind of the little mind explosions going like, oh, wait, I didn't realize that. One of my favorite activities to do when I'm doing a workshop on helping students think beyond flashcards is to use a set of superhero flashcards.
Right.
And it's always interesting to see how the different participants organize those cards. Some arrange them by publisher, Marvel versus DC. Some of them are arrange it by human versus non-human, by radioactive, or
Right, yeah.
I'm getting into your territory, Jim. And it's just really interesting seeing how they lay these things out. And so you can do something similar with the facts that your students are focusing on to help them build that into how do these things work together.
So when we say using flashcards in this way, we are shattering most of the preconceived notions that exist about how do you use flashcards.
Correct.
Flashcards we think of flashcards being a solitary activity.
Yes.
We think of flashcards being a very linear activity.
Yes.
You go through the deck one after the other.
Right.
This is a social activity. It's a group activity of what you're describing. It is it's one where you're not going through the cards one after the other. You're looking at all the cards at once and you're organizing.
Yes.
So it is. So that's a very interesting sort of thing. And I do remember sitting in a workshop where you did the superhero exercise, which I thought was really neat. How do you introduce an exercise like that? Do you talk about? I'm going to stand here and look and see what patterns you put together. How do you introduce this new concept? Because this is something students will never have done before in terms of flashcards. So how do you introduce this to them? And how do you teach them how to do it so they can do it on their own or in groups?
Well, I would do it first without their fact flashcards. I would do it with something like superheroes or flowers or whatever's appropriate for the course you're teaching. So it's kind of low stakes and, oh, this is fun. And, oh, isn't it funny how the different how people laid them out differently. And then you can talk about how these are all facts, but we all looked at it from different ways. So let's now pull out that giant stack of flashcards that you have that probably have a ring around it. You got it at Office Depot, color-coded. And,
Right.
Pinterest has pictures of them and all that kind of stuff. And let's start looking at yours. How do you arrange it? How you do it different than how somebody else does it? I think if you focus more on this notion of let's explore. Let's play.
Mm-hmm.
Let's play with this. Rather it being, how are you doing it?
Right, right.
Let's see if you're doing it right.
Yeah. Well, and isn't that one of the great challenges that we have when we're talking about helping students organize experiences or other aspects of learning? They are so much more. When I talk to students nowadays, I get so much more of the just tell me how to do it.
Yes.
As opposed to understanding that figuring out how to do it is as much a part of learning and remembering as anything else. Yeah.
Yes. And process is so important, and teaching our students how to go about that learning process instead of necessarily making sure that you're not just focusing on that end goal, that exam, that whatever, that being overt, here's the process, here's how I do my process, modeling it, and then having fun with it. There's a reason that you are, you have an advanced degree in your discipline because you found something fascinating about it. Help your students find that fascination too.
Yeah.
So
great advice. Great advice. So one final little thought, and I'm gonna make a prediction here based on the fact that we had a really good conversation in a previous episode about the difference between assessment and grades.
Yes.
So I'm going to guess we probably should avoid trying to grade the flashcard exercise.
Absolutely.
Okay.
If I find out somebody's trying to grade it, I will sick our student worker on.
We'll send over our student worker and make you feel guilty.
That's right.
You'll just sit in your office and look downtrodden.
Yes.
So and the reason for that is why?
Because then it's no longer about the learning and it's about the grade instead of focusing on how can I use this as a way of learning.
So if you want to assess if this worked or not, you're going to find some other instrument, some other mechanism then later on to test for that.
Yes. And I think if you really are feeling itchy about it, make it a formative assessment, a low stakes kind of thing that will help you understand help you gauge whether your students are understanding what is happening, what you are trying to help them learn. And if they are, putting the knee bone with the elbow and saying, oh, yeah, they're connected directly, then some reteaching needs to happen.
Exactly. Dr. Julianne McMahon, thank you again.
Thanks for having me.
And that's all the time we have for this week's episode of Let's Talk Teaching. You can find out more about the Center for Teaching, Learning, and Technology at our website, ctlt.illinoisstate.edu. Find out more about our podcast and how you can subscribe by clicking on the podcast link in the upper right of the page. For Julianne McMahon and for all of my colleagues here at CTLT, until we talk again, happy teaching.